You wake up, you slept fine, maybe even a full 8 hours, and yet by 10 in the morning your brain feels like it's wading through wet cotton. You're staring at an email you've read 3 times. You're mid-sentence, and the word you need just isn't there. You sit through a meeting nodding along, but nothing is actually landing. And here's the confusing part. You're not exhausted. Your body doesn't feel tired. So if it's not sleep debt, what is actually happening in there? Turns out the fog isn't coming from your sleep tank at all. It's coming from your fuel line. Today we're answering the real question. Why does your brain feel foggy, even when you're not tired? You've probably checked your sleep tracker. 8 hours, logged and confirmed. So you assume the fog must mean your body is secretly underrested, because that's the only explanation anyone's ever given you. But the timing doesn't fit. This fog doesn't act like tiredness. It moves around during the day in ways plain exhaustion never would. Which means the real question isn't why am I so tired, it's something stranger. What else inside your body could slow down your thinking without touching your energy levels at all? Something is interfering with the signal, and it has almost nothing to do with your pillow. Here's what's actually going on inside your skull. Your brain is a strange organ. It's only about 2% of your body weight, but it burns roughly 20% of your daily energy. And almost all of that energy comes from one single fuel source, glucose, delivered through the blood in a steady stream. Not a flood, not a trickle. A steady stream. Think of your brain like an engine that only accepts one type of fuel, and that fuel has to arrive at a constant, even rate for everything to run smoothly. Not too much at once, not too little, just steady. Now think about a typical lunch. Something quick, something carb-heavy, a sandwich, pasta, a bowl of cereal disguised as a salad. That food breaks down fast into glucose, and it floods into your bloodstream all at once. Your brain, for a moment, is thrilled. Fuel everywhere. But your body notices that flood too, and it responds the way it's designed to respond, by releasing insulin to clear that sugar out of the blood quickly. And here's the catch. Insulin doesn't politely bring things back to normal. It often overcorrects. So the same speed that brought glucose flooding in is the same speed that drags it back down, sometimes below where you started. That's the crash. That's the 3 p.m. wall. You ate lunch feeling fine, and an hour or two later, your brain is suddenly running on fumes, even though, technically, you're well fed. This crash is what we can call the fast signal. It's quick, it's noticeable, and your brain feels it almost in real time, because unlike your muscles, your brain can't store much backup fuel. Muscles can rely on stored glycogen for a while. Your brain has very little wiggle room. When glucose drops, brain function drops with it, almost immediately. This is the moment you're mid-sentence, reaching for a completely ordinary word, something you use all the time, and it just isn't there. That's not a memory problem. That's a fuel problem, happening in real time, tied directly to what's happening in your blood right now. But there's a second signal running underneath all of this. Slower, quieter, and honestly stranger. Inside your brain, you have these tiny immune cells called microglia. Think of them as the brain's internal security team, constantly patrolling, checking for damage, debris, or threats. Most of the time they sit quietly in the background. But microglia are sensitive to more than just physical injury. They can be activated by chronic stress, by inflammatory foods, by long stretches of physical stillness. Yes, sitting. Just sitting for hours can nudge these cells into a more alert, more reactive state. Once activated, microglia release chemical signals meant to manage a threat. That's their job. In small doses, this is useful. It's how your brain clears out damaged cells and keeps things maintained. But when activation happens repeatedly, or stays switched on because stress or stillness keeps signaling danger, those chemical messengers start interfering with something else entirely, the normal communication between neurons. Here's the metaphor that makes this click. Picture your brain's fuel as the gas in the tank, and the neuron-to-neuron communication as the wiring that carries the signal once the engine is running. Glucose volatility affects the gas. Microglial activation affects the wiring. The inflammatory signals these immune cells release act almost like static on a phone line. The call doesn't drop, the connection isn't gone, but the message gets noisier, slower, harder to make out clearly. That's the fog you feel while sitting through a meeting, technically listening, technically present, but nothing quite landing. The wiring is intact, it's just full of static. And this reaction isn't random or broken. It's actually an old survival mechanism, doing exactly what it evolved to do. Your body has ancient systems built to detect scarcity and threat, and stress, poor fuel, and prolonged stillness all register, at a biological level, as signs of exactly that, scarcity or danger. So your body responds the way it always has, by conserving resources and dialing things down, redirecting energy away from sharp, high-level thinking and toward basic survival functions. Except you're not in a famine, and you're not being chased by anything. You're sitting at a desk, dealing with a stressful email thread, barely moving for hours. Your biology doesn't know the difference. It reads the pattern, not the context. This is why brain fog can show up in a high-stress week, even when your sleep is completely normal. The trigger was never your pillow. The trigger was stress and stillness, activating the same ancient alarm system that governs fuel conservation. And this is the part that finally explains the mystery. Two completely different systems, one handling sugar delivery, one handling immune response, both end up producing the exact same result: slower thinking, blurred focus, a brain that feels tired even though it technically isn't. There's also a difference between a bad afternoon and a bad month. One rough lunch causing one rough crash is the acute version, temporary, isolated, gone by evening. But when stress, inconsistent meals, and long sedentary stretches stack day after day, microglia stay activated longer, glucose keeps swinging instead of settling, and the fog stops being an occasional visitor. It starts to feel like your baseline, like this is just who you are now, which is exactly why so many people assume the fog must be permanent, or personal, or tied to age, when really, it's tied to a pattern that's been quietly repeating. Here's the encouraging part in all of this. Fog is not a fixed setting. It's not a permanent feature of your brain that showed up one day and moved in for good. The whole system has a natural off switch, and it's simpler than you'd expect. When glucose arrives steadily, instead of in dramatic spikes and crashes, and when microglia aren't constantly being poked awake by stress or stillness, signal clarity tends to come back on its own. You've actually felt this already, without realizing what it was. That moment when fog lifts after a short walk, or after a small snack, and suddenly thoughts feel a little more available again. That's not a coincidence or a placebo. That's your brain responding almost immediately to a shift in fuel, or a dip in inflammatory noise. So here's one specific thing you can actually test. Not adopt forever, just test. For one day, before you eat any refined carbs at a meal or snack, eat a source of protein or fiber first. Not instead of the carbs, just before them. A handful of nuts before the bread. Some vegetables before the pasta, an egg before the toast. This isn't about cutting anything out. It's about changing the order things enter your system, because protein and fiber slow down how quickly sugar floods your bloodstream. Slower entrance, gentler rise, and critically, a softer crash on the other side. That crash is exactly what was pulling the floor out from under your focus around that 3 p.m. mark. Try it, then simply pay attention. Not with pressure, just with curiosity. Does the usual afternoon wall show up in the same way? Does it hit as hard? Does it hit at all? And here's something worth sitting with, because it matters more than the reset itself. None of this means your brain is broken, and it definitely doesn't mean you're failing at something everyone else seems to manage fine. That fog is your body doing exactly what it was built to do, protecting you under conditions it reads as scarcity or threat. Stress, unstable fuel, too much stillness. Your biology doesn't know these are just symptoms of a normal Tuesday. It reacts like they mean something is wrong, and it dials things down to conserve energy. The same ancient response that's been running quietly in the background this whole time. Over the next week, without turning this into a project, just notice a few things. Does the fog show up at the same time each day, almost like clockwork? Does it feel a little lighter on the days you ate protein or fiber first? And does it still spike during weeks that are heavy on stress or heavy on sitting, regardless of what you ate? You might start to see two separate patterns overlapping, one tied to meals, one tied to tension and movement, both landing on the same foggy result. This isn't a diagnosis, and it's not a promise that your brain will feel perfectly sharp every day from now on. That's not how bodies work, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What this actually gives you is smaller than that, and honestly more useful. It turns something invisible into something visible. Instead of a vague, directionless feeling of being off for no reason, you now have two real candidates to look at. Actual mechanisms with names, not mysteries. So go back to that moment from the very beginning. 8 hours of sleep, technically well rested, and still stuck in that wet cotton feeling, reaching for a word that won't come. Now you can look at that moment differently, not as unexplained tiredness, but as a signal about fuel and inflammation, something concrete instead of confusing. The next time your brain feels foggy, don't ask, why am I so tired? Ask, what did I just feed my fuel line? Because this whole time, the fog was never about how much you rested. It was about what you supplied, and how steadily you supplied it.